You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm doing great. The most interesting part of my day today was a meeting that you and I were both on. It was a demonstration and a overview with an IAM technology vendor. And what really wowed me was, the great reviews and ratings they had from analysts in this space. I mean, this wasn't obviously like I look at these analyst reports a lot, so I kind of intuitively knew, but it's just amazing how much things change on some of those reports in terms of that upper right quadrant or that leader space within from year to year, how much it can change, and how not only that, but kind of one of my things that I was reminded of was how no one vendor is the perfect vendor for everybody. And there's a reason why all these vendors exist, is that, every vendor has just the right stuff or just the right fit for whatever their base of clients is.
First of all, that's blasphemy, because everyone knows that Microsoft will solve all of our problems and has all the capabilities. This wasn't Microsoft looking at, but no, you're totally right. I think, it's the right fit for the right organization. There's plenty of products out there. There's too many products out there, I'll even say, that are very, very similar to each other. There might be some slight differences, and sometimes those slight differences are what make a difference between, we want to go with that vendor or another vendor or whatever it may be. But yeah, it was interesting. I think, we've seen sort of the established players come up over the years. I think everyone remembers kind of the old guard, and then it becomes the new guard. And then there's the disruptors, and then the disruptors become the new guard, and the freight train just kind of keeps on rolling. And the organizations that don't keep pace, keep innovating, things like that, they end up as the old guard, and they tend to fall off to the bottom left, or kind of struggle on in keeping things going. But it was certainly interesting. And, I don't think I want to name the vendor, because we try to be vendor neutral as much as we can. And, there's like anything else. I think there's good things, bad things, and things that we just don't know yet about it. But, that's one of the cool things about what you and I do, is I feel like that's a big part of our job, is to try to be aware of as many of those products that are out there and really understand the differences between them, to be able to, have a good handle of kind of where the industry is.
Yeah, I think, looking at the technology today, it reminded me also of, there are certain situations where a client will want a system that can be configured right from the UI. So more or less a product focused on the system administrator or the IT administrator implementing versus the developer. So a developer centric tool where, user interfaces developed from scratch. I think most products try to appeal to both audiences, but they find themselves more in one camp or the other.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think this is an area where I think an organization like Okta, for example, they kind of known for their end user flexibility and ease of use, and then they go out and buy Auth0, which is known for their APIs, right? And it's kind of like the behind the scenes plumbing. How that ends up, I think the book is still being written on it, but it is interesting. And I think this is part of why you need to know what your use cases are that you're trying to solve for, to be able to answer those questions. What is more important? Do you want to have configuration, or is just outright customization and totally being able to control the experience from every little bit on the screen? Is that the most important thing? And the differences vary between, enterprise solution versus a customer facing solution, or maybe a B2B, or even government or things like that. It's an interesting area, and really you've got to know what you want before you really start looking at product.
Yeah, I think, and what you want, I think the key from a vendor standpoint is who they're selling to as well. If you have that developer facing product, you're probably selling to developers or architects. If you have the IT administrator focus, that So the Auth0 model was probably more to sell to the technical people. The Okta model was more to sell to the business inclined or the system administration inclined user.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it was a smart pickup by Okta.
Yeah, it was interesting because in a lot of demos, the two of those, or in a lot of product selections that I was a part of, clients looked at both the systems. Some scenarios, the clients loved Okta and hated Auth0, and other scenarios, it was the exact vice versa. The Auth0 user interface had a lot of like code samples, which could be very intimidating if you're not a coder. You can look at this and say, wow, that's way too complicated. Whereas the developers might look at Okta and say, yeah, this is too much gloss. I want to get down into the weeds.
Or even too simple, or even doesn't have anything to do with technology. It's you had a bad experience with a salesperson from that company 5 years ago and you hate it and you're never going to buy them again. That's a real thing that happens too.
I've seen that a lot. I've seen it where salespeople just annoy the heck out of the client, and the client wants to stop taking their calls and just decides they just don't want to do business with that company. I've also seen scenarios where companies just decide this is the business we want to win. We're going to send our best team. We're going to put our best foot forward. The other company, maybe doesn't look at the opportunity as, that strategic, and it doesn't do that. They don't send their top team to go win that client.
Yeah, the hunger to win the deal is always an interesting thing to try and gauge and measure. But yeah, it's interesting. I think this is an area where the topic we're going to talk about today, which is passwordless, really kind of comes up because in my mind, it's disruptive right now. I think it's finally starting to hit the right, level of mind share, things like that, to be able to be aware of it. So what I want to do is let's pivot to passwordless, because we're going to invite our good old friend Frydentity, Alec Fry. He's a senior systems engineer with Transmit Security. And he was with us way back in episode 80, which was right around a year ago or so. So welcome back to the show, Alec.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us again and taking part in your evening or early morning, because I know you're in Australia. Is that right?
Yes, morning.
We're starting the day off with Identity at the Center, which is always great news for everybody. I guess what's new, since the last time you were on? What's been new in the last year or so?
Okay, so as I covered last time I spoke to you, I've worked in the identity space from lots of angles, being vendors, global system integrators, consultancies, and a couple of corporates that effectively were users implementing identity. And I've spent most of the last year actually working for a national Australian company that manages hotel venues and wineries, and working internally on their identity environment. So the focus really was managing their IAM operations, which included trying to improve the security of it through things like conditional access policies, MFA, and then focusing on the user experience as well, being the single sign-on and lifecycle management. So interestingly, as much as I loved working there, and the CISO was a great manager and everything, a couple of months ago, my ideal opportunity came up, which is why, as you know, I'm now with Transmit Security, and I get to live my passion of helping get the world passwordless. So that's a major news.
So Alec, passwordless is definitely the topic du jour, topic of the day. And we're wondering if you could, let's start at the basic level. Can you give us a 101 lesson on passwordless?
Certainly. So an interesting thing in passwordless is that there's a number of vendors that are saying they do passwordless. And the interesting way I describe it, I guess, is there's passwordless and then there's passwordless, or more importantly, I prefer to use the phrase now sans password, if the French labeling of without, because the interesting thing is there are vendor solutions that will do password minimization. So you'll register your user account with a username and password, as you always do, and then they may add MFA, which is something like a Google Authenticator, or sending an email with a one-time password, an OTP in it, or an SMS or whatever. And then people will say, okay, now let's try and downplay or minimize the number of times you need to enter that password. So it's minimized, but it's still technically there. And more importantly, the user record or the user account still actually runs on it. So if for any reason your account gets locked and you have to get reset, you've got to end up digging up what was my password, or you've got to do a password reset, or you've got to go back to a question and answer, what was my first car or my mother's maiden name or whatever it is. So all of those password / user data methods of authenticating is still under the bonnet. Now, passwordless, as in natively passwordless, or sans password, as I was saying, what I'm so excited about, especially like you said in the last year, what's changed, by coming into this space now, what I'm really excited to see is solutions that allow everything from the initial creation of a user record and access to an application all the way through to they log in however many times they want. If, for example, they haven't logged in for a year and you're in the position where normally people would be, oh, I'm logging in so infrequently, I've forgotten my password, or I've tried to log in so many times, I've locked it and got it wrong, I've locked my account and therefore I need account recovery. All of that instead can be done using MFA, so it's strong authentication, and the account creation all the way through its life cycle never, ever had a password even created for it or stored for it. So the key component there really is that the authentication is strong authentication in that it's MFA, and in the example that I'll be able to walk you through, the MFA consists of a biometric authentication, whether it's fingerprint or face ID or facial recognition, etc., and a device, so the something you have, where interestingly, many years ago, the something you have was an RSA token, or it could be a YubiKey or something else physically you've got to carry around. But now with such a high percentage of people carrying around a smartphone almost all the time, that serves very well as the something you have. So that's really the key basic component of this true passwordless or native passwordless is users authenticating without the need to even create a password at all.
Yeah, and I really want to geek out about all the biometrics and kind of forms of how you can, prove yourself without a password. But I'd like to start at a more basic level. And what I'd like to do is ask you about, what does the passwordless architecture look like? So let me give you kind of a sample use case, and then you kind of explain how passwordless might fit into an architecture. So very simply, what if I have, 2 or 3 web-based applications, and I want to enable passwordless for them? What does that architecture look like? What do I have to do to my web applications to make them passwordless?
That's an excellent question. Because effectively, for your applications, especially in the developer space where people are writing applications and one of the things they need to do is implement authentication for it. So in some scenarios, people will go straight in the app itself and try to code, how do I put in user authentication management directly? And another option is they'll say, let's actually point all of our applications to a centralized identity management system. Now, in the first case, and I'm talking very specifically from the passwordless identity solution that I implement at the moment. So that's why it's very specific in the details that I'm giving here. So as an example, there's an SDK available from which you can code directly into your application, making an OIDC call to our passwordless as a service solution. So where people are used to using a lot of as a service solutions that they can call via APIs or other calls, in this case OIDC, one option is build directly into your web app a call to, using the SDK, a call to this passwordless as a service. The other option is if you've got applications that are already integrated with a centralized identity management system. So if you're using one of the big vendor brands that does single sign-on, user record management, you can create multiple attributes for users that are relevant to the different target apps they're using. So you've already got your identity management system in place, but 9 out of 10 times, if not more, that identity management system will still run on a username password design. What we can do is, again, because our passwordless is as a service, you can just make a call from that system directly to our passwordless as a service, so that at the point in time when that system that's managing user privileges and user access and all the rest of it, when that would say, oh, now's the time I would normally prompt the user to enter a username and password, or a username and password followed up with a Google Authenticator code or whatever else. Instead, it just says, right now, I'm just going to make a call to this Bind ID service and say, hey, can you pop up the prompt that asks the user to do a biometric authentication to their known device or their registered device? And then when the result comes back, it says, yes, successfully authenticated. So this mechanism is really around making that passwordless authentication request and getting the result back. Where, back to the first part of your question, if you were to build, for example, directly into your application code, because there are tools available, like there's standards like FIDO2, which utilizes WebAuthn and CTAP, and you could actually say, we want to code directly in our application, similar to people, I guess, that build applications that say, I can do all the authentication myself. I just need to go to GitHub and look for available shareware and whatever else that I can start putting in there. But having said that, if you code it yourself, and even though the FIDO standard and WebAuthn and CTAP are available and people can utilize those, what we've done with making it as a service model is, by making that one call to our solution, we then take care of all of the flows and all of the different orchestration and the micro journeys. So, for example, if you went to authenticate with a device that had biometric installed but not enabled, then what happens next? And so that whole flow of, here's all the if-then use cases, we've got that all built in and designed and orchestrated. So, for example, the happy journey, a user goes to log into your app, because you make that completely call to our SaaS offering, up pops the prompt, they biometric authenticate, they're straight in. Alternatively, if they didn't have a device that supported that, they could then instead type in their mobile phone number on the screen, and it would send a link directly to their phone, and they could do the biometric there. Or if they don't support biometric at all, then the fallback is that you can send an email with an OTP code in it that they then key in. So what we've taken the time and effort to design is a passwordless model that, ideally, the happiest scenario is a straight out facial recognition or thumbprint on your phone, or even thumbprint on your PC. But right down to the lowest level of, okay, if you're in an environment that doesn't support all that, we do still have to fall back to something not quite as technical, or not quite as user friendly, for example, like getting an email with an OTP code in it. But we still never resorted down to that layer or threshold of passwords. That's the key thing from our design, is they don't exist in the environment at all. So I hope that wasn't too off the topic.
No, I think that gives a lot of the detail behind it. I would say what it sounded like to me is that there's very much like a federation scenario where the passwordless provider is really like the identity provider. It's authenticating and then passing the authenticated user back to the service provider or the application, if you will.
Exactly, because what was interesting to me is what I've come across in the last few years is systems that are identity management systems that were adding in MFA functionality, and then we're trying to tweak that in a way that says, let's downplay the password prompt and let's utilize the MFA authentication where we can, or but effectively kind of craft a passwordless type experience. And that's why what I'm so excited with here is, instead, this offering of, don't actually try and craft one yourself. Just at that point, just say, we're going to make a pass straight off to you guys. You'll do the biometric passwordless for us and give us the result back. So it's exactly like you said. There'll be scenarios where there's an identity solution that a customer already has that, for all intents and purposes, is their IDP. But in the configuration for that solution, they will have an option that says, in these cases, or ideally in every case, actually federate to a different IDP, which is this as a service passwordless.
Yeah, it sounds very much like where the use case that you're talking about was a lot based on biometrics and smartphone. I still, based on my experience of working with a lot of different clients, there are those use cases where you can't rely on the person having a smartphone, but I would assume there are ways that a passwordless system can work with YubiKey or that RSA token that you talked about. We worked with a client where they had folks who worked in prisons And in a prison, you can't bring your smartphone in. So does that mean you can't use the application? Well, that's not really going to work, right? They have to make a system that pretty much all of their users can use. But I was interested more in this smartphone scenario. Is to use the passwordless technology, do I have to install software? Is software installing automatically? And then I guess to that point, like, do I need a smartphone? So can passwordless, for example, the product from the company that you work for, handle that scenario where the person cannot have a smartphone?
There's a couple of parts to that question, I guess, that I want to try and address. So, first of all, one of them I'll say is about segmenting the user base. So, for example, where you said there's a scenario where a user can't have a mobile phone on them, like in prisons. One of the key benefits, I guess, with using this as a service model is that within whatever identity environment you've got configured, you can actually specify which subsets of times you do want to use this. So you can have policies that say anytime, for the scenario where a user does have a phone, this is the scenario. Or if they're in the user group that says they have to use YubiKey, then you might use YubiKey instead of this. So one of the key things is, and that is an ideal point, because some of the concerns that some customers we talk to have is they assume when they hear a bit about how our passwordless works is they say, oh, does that mean I have to completely re-engineer my whole environment? Or, is this a 2-year project to cut over? And the benefit of this, or the beauty or the simplicity of this, is that it's not at all. Because it's as a service, you can slice off a small subset of users for a certain condition and say, in this instance, for this condition, then do the passwordless call, and then start expanding it to more and more of your user cases and user base. So it's not like it has to be an all or nothing. So for that reason, you may still use something like YubiKey directly, separately through your IAM solution, independent of where you call our passwordless as a service. So for the other part of your question about whether it requires an app to be installed or anything like that, one of the key benefits here is that it's totally appless. It's a solution that lets users use the same biometric or passwordless authentication across different environments. So it's omni-channel, and it allows you to use a number of devices. So you can actually register more than one device to your profile. So the idea behind it is to make sure that all we're doing is using the technologies already implemented by the phone vendors, pretty much. So Apple, Samsung, Google, they've kind of done all the heavy lifting for us, in that we just piggyback right off that technology of the biometric that's in the devices, the fact that they are all, or nearly all, pretty much FIDO capable or FIDO2 capable, and using WebAuthn and CTAP. So for that reason, by orchestrating the components together, we're providing that passwordless experience, but we don't involve any apps that you need to install, or any hardware that you need from us, or even you don't need to install any agents in your network environment to connect component A to component B. So that's kind of what we find is our real strength, is that ability to just say, you've got everything in place you need to do passwordless now. You just need to make like a call to our service that connects it all together. Because one of the other key things as well is, when people say, oh, well, will people be able to use this? I mean, how much do they need to learn? One of the interesting side effects, I guess, of COVID over the last few years is nearly everyone now is familiar with grabbing their phone, pointing at a QR code and scanning it. And in a lot of these phones nowadays are thumbprint or facial recognition capable. So for us, the answer is 90% of your customers or user base are already extremely familiar with exactly what they will need to do to use this passwordless, with, as I said, the benefit that it can be across devices. They don't need to install anything. You don't need to install anything in your network. And the other benefit as well is that by being omni-channel and cross-environment like it is, just also going back to your other question about if devs wanted to build this in as well, what happens is there are some scenarios where people have built an app and they've said, hey, I can tie directly to a biometric prompt for this app, and I can ask people to authenticate with biometric when they log in. The interesting challenge there is, especially if this is on something like a web browser on their PC, if they then log in a different web browser, or they log in an incognito mode, or a number of those different things that will actually, I guess, break the standard FIDO2 flow that you've designed, that would mean a lot of extra work for the developers to cater for each of those. And again, that's where what we've done is we've pulled all that together that said, doesn't matter if they're switching browsers, if they're in incognito, all of that still gets picked up and read and managed by our solution. So the other component to that I just touched on, which was the omni-channel, is that as an example, we've got a component that says you can even have a call center mechanism where the user rings your call center from a mobile phone. And as you've probably experienced yourselves, when you do that and it says, oh, from this mobile phone, I assume you're customer XYZ, but then you'll still almost always have someone that answers that says, great, can you tell me your date of birth or your address or whatever other questions they need to ask you? Instead, in this mechanism, it can just call, because you're calling from your phone, it can pop straight up on your phone with the actual authentication, the biometric authentication request, and then the dial-in or the phone call you're making will just say, hey, we just sent you a link. You've just completely authenticated biometrically, etc., passwordlessly. So you're totally in your account, and we don't need to ask you all of those questions again.
I think what is sometimes lost in all of this is that it's a flexible solution. It's not a all or nothing, right? And I think this is where I think some people maybe struggle with deploying this is, okay, well, if not all my users can use it, then forget it. I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I think it's looking at the right subset of users. Because I think of, the scenario that you talked about, or Jim talked about, in a prison, for example, not bringing it to a cell phone. Now, I want to be very clear. We're not talking about the prisoners. We're talking about the guards typically. They're not allowed to bring things into the environment, but prisons aren't the only places. There's clean rooms all around the world, maybe from like an IT perspective. I see that a lot of times in outsourced call centers and things like that. You're not allowed to bring things in. I think there's still flexibility in the model for passwordless to be able to leverage any of the modern authentication biometric solutions that are out there, whether it's phone, whether it's Windows Hello, whether it's Apple's Face ID, Touch ID things that are now, I think, on enough devices where it is prevalent. If you had said, okay, well, 5 years ago, you have a fingerprint reader, you're probably only talking about a ThinkBook that was like 4 inches thick itself and was, a weapon in some states. Now you've got thin devices. Biometrics are built in through either an IR camera or a fingerprint reader. And so there's flexibility. And I think this is an area where don't let perfect be the enemy of progress. Roll it out to the people who can take advantage of it, improve the user experience for some people and the security experience, for some people, rather than just trying to go for this big bang approach. So now that I think about okay, yeah, I'm ready to put it out there. The question that I always have for all vendors in this space of passwordless is, why should I pay extra for it? And I think this is sometimes a difficult question to answer, sometimes because I see companies like Microsoft, Okta, who are password dashless, right? They're obfuscating the password, they're hiding the password, it's still there. You're still prompted every so often to put it in versus true passwordless. And I think like a CISO is, okay, well, is that good enough? Or what is the value if I do go for true passwordless? I know it's a tough question to answer sometimes, but I'm going to throw it out there. Why do I need something like that versus something that might already be built in?
No, sure. Excellent question. And I guess that leads to an interesting topic that I haven't really covered off yet so far, that the difference in the market between the IAM enterprise user base and a SIAM customer identity user space. Because as you were saying, in an enterprise environment, for example, where you can do things like you can manage what user equipment people have, whether it's phones that you give them or that you've got MDM, so you've got management on it and that kind of thing. So the interesting variations or components to answer your question, one of the key things is the amount of money that is spent presently on password resets and account recoveries. So without sort of going into the weeds of that, but a lot of people in the sales space will say, okay, so if you can identify how much you're spending on password resets, and there's all those people that have stats that say things like $10 per call to correct a password, or 5 minutes of a customer service center's person's time, something like that. So one way of looking at the justification for the expense is how much money you're saving by not having to do all those password reset calls or account recovery calls. But more importantly, to flip now to the SIAM focus, And that's where our solution really is geared at the moment. Is the market we're really trying to expand on is the SIAM space, because some of the key benefits that we talk about is the loss or the reduction to the number of cart abandonment scenarios, or the user experience of people wanting to sign up to your website, but there's such an enrollment process of all the details they need to enter and everything else, or a password. You probably had this experience yourself. You go to a website that you haven't been to for so long. It says, are you an existing user? And you're like, no, I don't think I am. So you go to register, you put your email address in. It says, sorry, that email address already exists. You must be a valid user already. So what's your password? And you go, oh, okay. And now you have to go through the whole password recovery. So from a SIAM space, because the other variations there is in the SIAM space, any company that is authenticating or providing access to their customer base, they don't have any kind of control of their customer base in terms of what devices they're using, how many different devices they may use. So there isn't those features like the MDM device management capability. And for that reason, what we do here is we say you can let your customers straight into your website without a lengthy sign-up process for which some people might drop off. Also, you will not have the risk of cart abandonment because they won't be at the end of the shopping process. And then some websites will say at the end of the shopping process, yep, you picked out everything you want. Now, some of them say you can purchase as guest, which I'll be honest, I actually do that more often than not because it's quicker. But of course, from the company's point of view, they don't get the user, the know your customer information that they would like to get from that. So of course, they'd rather that you register and sign up, in which case sometimes people will drop out. And that's, to go on a slight tangent, that's an interesting thing that we, in our company, we just recently, we did a Gen Z, I call it Gen Z, I guess your customers will mostly, or your listeners will mostly call it Gen Z, but we did a big survey about their usage patterns and why they're kind of pushing for passwordless in this day and age and that kind of thing. And the kind of interesting factors that we found is that a lot of them have more than two devices or more than two mobile phones, which I find interesting because even though we've all got a PC, maybe a tablet, maybe a mobile phone, they're also starting to collect more than one mobile phone. But some of the other key things about their behaviors were things like they're very high, very highly likely to do cart abandonment. They just want access to be immediate and quick. And the interesting thing was the number of like the count of how many of them aren't aware of what phishing attacks are or how they work. So like they were kind of ignorant to phishing attacks. And of course, one of the most prevalent things with phishing attacks is it'll be a fake site or a fake link that says, hey, log in with your credentials here. And by doing that, you're typing in username password, which they capture. So there's always that weakness and that security risk. So to your question about sort of why spend the extra money on a true passwordless scenario, as I said, there's the scenario of, well, it saves you the money that you're spending on password resets. But then from the marketing point of view for SIAM, it's not having potential customers drop off and cart abandonment and everything else.
So, Alec, one of the things that I think is, real key in terms of the difference between enterprise passwordless and customer passwordless. Well, let me bring up two areas. I won't bury it into one question like I normally do. So the first one is the difference on the enterprise side is that you're going to have some legacy applications that are very hard to integrate with, that use case you talked about earlier was, hey, I've got 2 or 3 web applications. I want to integrate them with a passwordless solution. Now, on the enterprise side, I might have some client server apps. I might have a legacy mainframe application. So I think that's very difficult to integrate those with a passwordless solution. Almost like you need to have a workaround. I've seen some solutions where they say, all right, well, you've been authenticated with the passwordless. We're going to let you change the password for that application so you don't have to remember it, kind of change it on the fly, define the password and get in. And that way, you kind of solve the issue because the user's picking their password and then they're able to log in. And I know that your company focuses primarily on the customer side. So I won't ask you to tell me how to solve that. But the one I will throw to you, I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball at you here because I think this is somewhat societal. somewhat of a societal issue, but it's also somewhat of a pure business issue on the customer side, where if you're depending on some more advanced technology like a smartphone to do a biometric, you may run into the scenario where you fail to include people who don't have smartphones, right? And don't have that advanced technology. Now, if you're an e-commerce site, that's unacceptable. You don't want to have a technological hurdle that you can't do business with us. You can't buy our products because you don't have an iPhone. So I don't know if kind of you've thought about that at all in terms of, you know, how do you solve for that scenario of like wanting to have passwordless, um, but not leaving behind folks who maybe don't have the technology?
So that's an excellent question. In that, if I go back to the comment I made earlier, I guess it doesn't need to be an all or nothing solution, so that you can still implement this type of passwordless for the users to which it applies. And interestingly, what we're seeing just from a cultural issue as well is, even when we do a demo and we say this is how totally user friendly and simplified the passwordless experience is, we know people look at that and say, that's great, but it's almost like a leap of faith to say, I'm going to put that out there and have all my customers use that. I still want to back up somehow of, if they really want a password, they can have one. Or, we still need to cater for users that we already have using passwords, which, on a slight tangent, what we've actually built in again to the functionality and allow our customers to implement if they want to, is you can either have a customer log into your website directly using passwordless, and then it says, hey, for the very last time, type in your username and password that you used to use for this account, and it will be bound to this passwordless. Or alternatively, you can have the user log in as they normally would with a username and password, and then in their dashboard you can pop up a, hey, would you like to go passwordless? If so, just click this. It will launch our process, which actually registers them and registers their device at the time they do it. And then that company can tie that account to say, this user who used to log in with a password is now switched over to passwordless. So we're aware of the fact that it needs to be introduced to people, sort of, they need to be guided through how to switch over. To your point, what we've got, again, sort of as our lowest common denominator, I guess, to describe it, is that we can still say there is a passwordless way to access this system you're trying to get to, which is, we will email you a magic link or an OTP. So it's still not using a password, but we are catering for the fact that you don't have a biometric. Um, there's also some cases where, uh, again, we can fall back to the fact that if you don't have biometric on your handset, you might use just the screen code or PIN number. So our ideal is to do that highest level of MFA being the biometric and the device, but we can cater for the lower levels like the PIN numbers or the patterns. Again, we're just trying to make sure we steer away from passwords altogether. But to the point that we were just on a few minutes ago, that I just want to really quickly circle back, is from a user experience point of view, what this does let us do, like the ideal scenario, and I guess this is the ideal scenario that will eventually come into play, because like you said, it's a new technology. Not every user can use it right away, and people need to get used to it. But the ideal, and this is what I put up on my LinkedIn, kind of to try and really catch people's attention, was to show that your login experience could now pretty much be one button on the page of a website that just says access here. And when you do, again, with the orchestration and that kind of thing that's in our solution, what it can do is it can say, okay, I'm going to prompt you for a passwordless. You're going to do your biometric, etc. You're going to authenticate. What that does is it feeds back to the application that called it and says, here is the user just authenticated. Yes, it's this user. They've got this handset or their phone, whatever. And then that system that you're trying to access, or the application, can say, okay, either you're a valid user, and that's terrific, you go straight in, or you're not a valid user yet because I don't know who you are, in which case I'm going to assume you might want to register. And it can pop up on the screen and say, do you want to complete your half populated registration? So even that step of originally people going to websites and it says either log in or register or whatever, it can now just be one access button that says, if you're authenticated and you're a user, straight through. If you're authenticated successfully, as a correct person with these details, but you're not a user yet, then we pre-populated the rego process, and you just need to put in whatever last couple of details the company wants from you. So we've tried to tie the whole process flow of the registration, the user access, and the account recovery in a similar thing. With the last point that I'll just make is, because we cater for multiple devices, if for some reason, like in regards to account recovery, if you're adding a new device, you could go to authenticate and the system would say, hang on, you're logging in from a brand new device that you've never used before. Can I just get you to do the biometric that's popping up now on the device you do know, that we do know of, and you do it there, and then it kind of vouches for the new device. Similarly, the last feature in that whole space is we've got the component of a recovery contact, or I like to call them a recovery buddy, which is you can even nominate another person who's a Bind ID user, and if you completely lock out, then they can kind of vouch for you and authenticate and let you back in. So again, we tried to cater for as much of an expansive environment. There may be, like you said, there may be those scenarios where we don't have it covered. If that's the case, luckily in today's day and age, whatever system is in place to cover that use case right now would still be utilized by whoever's using our solution. But ideally, today, people might use our solution for 70 to 80% of their user base. Over the next few years, ideally, it ends up becoming 100% of the user base, because everyone ends up being smartphone or biometrically capable or whatever else.
My head's already starting to spin with all the possibilities, but also the things that can and can't go wrong. I love the idea of nominating someone else to manage my password. It's almost like crowdsourcing password resets amongst the people. I'm sure that's not the intention, but that's where my feeble brain is going at this point. I think we've gone, pretty far into the passwordless kind of journey here, and I want to kind of bring us up, start to head to the surface here, because you've been very generous with your time, and I want you to be able to get on with your day. But it wouldn't be an Identity at the Center episode, at least a recent one, if we didn't try to, liven it up a little bit. So I'd love to hear from you if you have any interesting, funny, sad stories when it comes to identity and access management.
I do have a funny one that I recall from a long time ago. And so this is 20 plus years ago now, when RSA secure ID tokens sort of first came out. And in the second generation token, they made the waterproof model. And back then I was implementing and selling them, etc. So when the waterproof model came out, I was so excited to test it. I immediately filled a glass of water on my desk, put it in there, had something hold it down for like 10 minutes, took it out, shook it off, and went, wow, look at that. It's still ticking. What's that old, it took a licking, but it keeps on ticking. I don't know if you remember that old watch ads. But then I was so excited by that. Anyway, the next morning I walk into the office and a colleague of mine comes in holding up a token where the inside, the ink is all kind of leaking everywhere, and it's unusable, and looking really depressed, and says to me, oh, Alec, it doesn't work. Look, I put it in water, and look what's happened to it. And I said, well, that's weird. I put mine in water for 10 minutes. And he goes, oh, I put mine in water for like 4 hours. And I thought, surely that can't be the difference. And then another colleague just happened to walk in at that point in the story and say, oh yeah, but go ahead, tell Alec the rest of the story. And I said, well, what's the rest of the story? And he said, what? I just boiled the kettle first.
So that turned into a MFA token soup of some sort.
Exactly.
Not exactly the most portable MFA solution that's out there. I guess, if you're not doing it right, it might become something of who you are with burns on it, maybe.
Yeah, I think we need to advertise passwordless and boil-proof solutions.
There you go. Jim, how about yourself? You got any good IAM stories you want to share?
I don't know if it's a good story, but one of my favorite stories was my first IAM go live, and we took a business critical portal live on an IAM system. It's actually 5 different portals all together on one IAM system. So it's kind of the definition of big bang, not from a functionality standpoint, but certainly from kind of a business impact standpoint. It was really a big bang. And we went live on, I think it was on a Friday night, and I remember sleeping in a conference room. I mean, just literally like all weekend, because as people were coming online, we wanted to make sure that they were able to register, and we were monitoring how many help desk calls there were, how many problems that people were having. And we had, come up with an estimate that, as many as 10% of people would run into an issue kind of merging their accounts, right? So basically, the way it was happening was that people could have up to 5 accounts, an account on each one of the portals, and have to merge all those into one account. And so we had a process for doing that. And we estimated that 10% of the people might run into a problem called the help desk. Well, the problem was that like everybody, once this functionality was available, everybody wanted to do it like right away. And so our 10% estimate was actually high, but at the same time, our help desk got kind of overwhelmed because of how many people wanted to go out and take advantage of this new single sign-on functionality. So it was kind of a crazy launch, but I was kind of a lot younger than I am now, and like had a different level of energy, and it was exciting. And during the go live, we had a projector, and we were watching Office Space, and just cracking up and having a good time, and eating pizza and sleeping in the conference room.
That sounds like a lot of fun, actually. I wish I had a good story. Mine is sad, only in that it was because of poor planning on the business side. So my background is IM operations, building accounts, things like that. And there was one of the companies I used to work for. They were spinning up essentially a new. I'm trying to make sure that I don't burn anybody here. So they're spinning up a new line of business, let's just call it. And there was a mass onboarding event that was going to be taking place, and typically that would take a couple weeks to try and get that coordinated. And we're talking hundreds of users that we need to be spun up pretty quickly. And I'll never forget Christine and myself being on the phone, and it's New Year's Eve, and we're both on call, and we're the ones that have to deal with creating, I don't know, I must have created 400 accounts just that night alone. And I can tell you, my alt tab skills, my video gaming mouse and keyboard skills totally came into play for that one. I was cranking out these accounts left and right. And yeah, that's my saddest New Year's Eve story ever. It's me sitting at home, cranking out a bunch of these proprietary custom single sign-on authentication accounts. And Christine, if you're out there and you're listening, I'm throwing up my fists. We did it. We got it done. But boy, was I not happy coming back in the office after the holiday break for that one, for sure. And I made it very clear that was not going to happen again, and that we need to fix that process.
Everyone was well rested except for you.
Yeah, I get it. Things happen, mistakes, but could have seen this coming a mile away and still ended up having to deal with it. That's always the frustrating part, right? Is when there's going to be a problem, and either nobody listens or still somebody slips through the cracks, and the answer is you got to roll up your sleeves and fix it. And sometimes that's just the way it is, and so be it. But who would have known 15 years later, roughly, it would turn into a story on the Identity Center podcast. But I guess there was some value to be had after all. Okay, we have waxed poetic. We talked melted MFA tokens. We talked passwordless. We got into a lot of detail of exactly how this works. Well, not exactly, but in a pretty good amount of detail, I would say. There's always wrinkles out there from a deployment standpoint, but also, the fact that it doesn't have to be an all or nothing. And I think this is probably the most important thing that I would like to get out there as part of this episode is make progress. This is a good technology. It improves the user experience. It improves the security. And those are wins. And it does not have to be an all or nothing scenario. Try it out, see how it works. Obviously Alec is with Transmit Security. They have an approach to do it. There are other vendors in that space as well. In the show notes, I'll include a link to Alec as well as Transmit Security, so that we can find out more information about them. But I'm sure Alec is always happy to connect and engage. You can check out his super sweet profile pic, which I think I commented in our last episode, number 80. Go back and listen to that one about the Superman shirt underneath the dress shirt, the Millennium Falcon as the kind of banner image. I'm totally all in for that. So hopefully, Alec, you'll be cool with people reaching out if they've got questions to you directly, and connecting up with them. And you can always connect with Jim and I on LinkedIn, as well. We're always happy to talk shop or not even share gifts. Right? I'm all for that as well. But always happy to have conversations. So. With that, we're going to go ahead and call it for this week. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Alec, thank you much for starting your day with us by recording this.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, and we'll go ahead and talk with everyone in the next one. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.